Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to actually have a chance to speak to everybody today on a celebration of World Water Day. And I think World Water Day is a great opportunity to collectively get together and, if nothing else, I think, share stories about water. Water in our community and water globally. And I'd like to just take a little bit of time today to share with you, I think, the story about water here in Alberta. And as it turns out, I think our story is, in many respects, same as the story about water in many places around the world, but in other aspects, very different. And our story is about one, here in Alberta, about opportunity. And that's the word that I want to leave you with. I think we have in this province the benefit of a huge opportunity in front of us to do a really good job in terms of how we manage water here in the province. So I'm going to take a few minutes and just share this story with you today. One of the greatest storytellers that I know of kind of talked about water, and he said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting over. And I think we always use this context to say that for most people, water's a very personal issue, and water's very personal for the people that I work with, and I think a lot of the people that I think you work with as well. If there's something that I can leave you with today, the challenge, I think, of our next generation evolves around these three issues. And this axiom is something that has come to front in the last several years. And it's the balance and the interactions between these three things. So you as students, if you're looking for an opportunity somewhere in the future about economics and environment, it's built around these three issues about water, food, and energy. Because why? They're all connected. And in fact, everybody realizes that it takes a lot of energy to move water around. That water itself is a source of energy. That in fact, for the first time, I think, in the history of mankind, we're burning food to create energy. That food itself is being used as a vehicle to move water around the world. The interconnections between all of these three are absolutely fascinating, dynamic, and going to be the challenge of our next generation. Part of our story here in Alberta is the same as it is around the world, and it turns out that across the world, most of the water is used for agriculture, for growing food, and that's the same story that it is here in Alberta. The rare exceptions, of course, the rarer exceptions are in Europe and in North America, where more of the water is used for industrial use, but collectively water is used around the world to grow food, and that's the same story here in Alberta. In fact, it's been that way for quite a while now. Since the early 1900s, agriculture has accounted for most of the annual water use across the world, and in fact is anticipated to account for another 40% increase by 2020. So we've got water issues, there's just no doubt about it. Alberta has roughly 10% of our population, 7% of the land area, and about 2% of our water supply. I get taken to task for the 2% number because the 2% might involve a calculation of how much water is used versus how much water is allocated or available. But the fact of the matter is, here in Alberta, we don't have a lot of water to spare. Now, like a lot of the world, the water that we do have isn't where we need it. Because in fact, and I'm going to show you a slide on that in the very next slide, but I think it's really important for people to understand just a few basic concepts about how water is managed here in this province. And the first thing that you have to understand is that all water is owned by the province. That all withdrawals of surface water and most of the groundwater under 4,000 parts per million total dissolved solids actually needs to be licensed. And that in this province we have something called FITFR, which is first in time, first in right. And what that essentially means is the people who were here first in this province, the first people to drag a wagon train across the prairie and put a stake into the ground, actually are the folks who have the most senior rights to water here in this province. So that essentially means, for the most part, the people who were here first are the farmers and the ranchers and the rural people who actually helped settle this province. And they've got the most senior water licenses here in the province. There are no interbasin transfers generally allowed in the province. They can happen, but it takes a lot of work to make this happen. It actually takes legislation and a bunch of political action to make it happen. But for the most part, You cannot move water between these basins. You have to live essentially within your means, within your own water basin. And that Saskatchewan has to get its fair share of water. Not a lot of people know this, but in fact 50% of the eastward flowing water must be delivered to the Saskatchewan border at prescribed quality levels. So we've got to make sure that we get half of the eastward flowing water delivered over to Saskatchewan. And the answer is, generally we've been doing a pretty good job of that. It gets a little tougher in drought years, but for the most part, we've been lucky, and Saskatchewan has been getting their fair share of water. Here's the challenge that we have in our province essentially. 80% of our water is in the northern half, only 20% of our water is in the southern half. 80% of our population just happens to live in the south, and 20% lives in the north. So like most of the world, here in Alberta, the water that we have is not necessarily where we need it. Most of the water, in fact, in the south is in fact used for irrigation. We're going to talk a little more about this. But since the 1900s, water allocations, and I want to be very careful here because there is a big distinction between water allocations and water use. And you need to understand the difference. But looking at water allocations, since the 1900s, in fact, agriculture has consistently accounted for most of the water allocations in this province. Commercial and industrial, in fact, has begun to account for a bigger amount of those allocations. But in general, allocations have almost doubled in total since the 1960s. In fact, now when we look at allocations versus use, so this is what a water license is allocated to versus what is actually used. In fact, provincially, we in fact have allocated about 10 billion cubic meters of water to be allocated annually across the province, and about a third of that is actually used. Now you have to remember, of course, that in fact we've still got to make sure we deliver 50% of our water to Saskatchewan, but as a rule of thumb, 10 billion cubic meters is allocated, we're using about a third of that. Agriculture is in fact the biggest user of that, at about 2.2 billion cubic meters a year of water being used. And then we get into industrial and cooling and the other sectors. This is just a slide to reinforce. In fact, it's about 3.2 billion cubic meters of water is used every single year. Agriculture is clearly the biggest component of water use in the province. 69% of all the water that is used by agriculture.